All right, in this segment, we're going to talk about Freud's psychosexual stages, and now we're going to talk about his actual stages of development. So, in the last one, we talked about Freud's iceberg and how the personality develops. Now, we're going to talk about some psychosexual stages that the person goes through, where at different ages, so the different stages will be represented by different ages. There are different focuses of that psychic energy that is present in the id that we talked about in the last segment. So the psychic energy, if you recall, is made up of libido, which is your life force, and thanatos, which is your death force. Erogenous zones are different parts of your body. So the psychic energy will get attached to different parts of the body at different stages. All right, let's check out this theory and see if it starts to make sense. So, first stage, at birth. So from birth to about 18 months of age, babies are in the oral stage of development. So their erogenous zone is their mouth. All of their psychic energy is attached to their mouth. And so you see babies doing a lot of, sucking. As they get older, they'll be biting and chewing. They'll be making sounds with their mouth. Like their mouth is sort of everything. So all of their life energy and all of their death energy is attached to their mouth. Mostly we see a lot of life-affirming behaviors in babies, but as they get a little bit older, usually over the age of 1, when they start having, teeth and things like that, you can start to see some sort of destructive behaviors with their mouths where they bite. A lot of times babies around the age of 9 months seems to be a really common time for babies to start biting, usually their moms, if they're nursing, and or body parts like arms. And, you get home from work and the toddler comes toddling up and wraps its arms around your legs and then bites your kneecap. And you're like, what was that? So the oral stage is expressed in life-affirming behaviors, but also some destructive ones, right? And they don't care that it hurts. I don't think they even have a concept that it hurts somebody else, but they definitely don't care that it hurts somebody else. So they're doing things with their mouth that are very consistent with, life-affirming and death-affirming behaviors. Really the common state of a person who's between 0 and 18 months is very dependent. For a lot of that period of time, they can't move independently. They can't do anything on their own. They can't find food. They can't get dressed. They can't move. They are really super dependent on their caregivers to fulfill every single need. As they start to exit that period, okay, they're walking. They maybe can open a cupboard. They can be doing some things to maybe theoretically they could obtain some of these basic life-affirming things, but they're really still very super dependent. They get carried a lot of places. They get pushed in a stroller a lot of places. They're very dependent during the oral stage. So that's going to be really important in a second. The next stage of development, Freud called the anal stage. Most people in my classes have no objection to the oral stage. They're like, okay, that makes sense. That's logical. Wait, what is this anal stage? That sounds horrible, right? Between 18 and 36 months, the erogenous zone is the bowel and the bladder. Okay, this is not sounding any better. But what's really happening in this stage is that the most children during this period are being potty trained. So they're starting to learn how to control their bowel and their bladder. And really what is characteristic of this stage is, whereas oral stage, it was dependence, here it's about trying to gain control, right? Trying to have control over themselves, trying to control their environment. If you've ever heard the term terrible twos, part of the reason why toddlers in this age are considered to be sort of terrible twoers is that they are trying to control their environment. So they start to say no. My 18-month-old, almost 2-year-old grandson now, actually, he says stop all the time. So, if you start singing a song, he'll be like, stop. If you start, tickling his feet, he'll laugh, and then go, stop. He's just trying to learn how to control other people, right? And it's not, even if he wants you to do it, he'll tell you stop. It's really kind of an interesting thing because I think he's trying to figure out, can he make you stop? And, being a parent or a grandparent, you're like, oh, okay, it's bugging him. And then he's like, no, do it again. I didn't mean for you to stop. I just wanted to see if you would. But that's really common during this stage, and it's part of getting control over themselves and becoming autonomous individuals. During the phallic stage, okay, it's starting to sound worse and worse, isn't it? Because phallus is another word. It's a Latin word for penis. So During the phallic stage, between 3 and 6 years of age, the erogenous zone becomes the genitals. Okay, so it's really important for us as adults reading or watching this to think not sexual. This is not about sexual arousal or anything like that. It's the psychic energy, life and thanatos, right? Libido and thanatos being attached to the genitals, which means they are putting all their psychic energy into it. What they're really doing during this phase is developing their gender identity. So between 3 and 6 years of age, according to Freud, little children look down, and if they see a penis, they think, yay, I'm one of the chosen ones. And if they don't see a penis, they think, oh no, somebody must have cut off my penis in the past. Okay, so now you're starting to see why people might have objections to Freudian theory, right? Because it's like, okay, wait, what? But he really believed that little girls, when they looked down and saw an absence of a penis, didn't think to themselves, oh, it's because I'm a girl and I have other genitals. They looked down instead and thought, what happened to my penis? Just to make it sound even crazier, I mean, you got to remember he was writing in the Victorian period of history between 1880 and 1920. In large part, he was writing these theories. And the idea that children during that period knew that there were alternative kinds of genitals when they were 3 to 6 years old is really kind of questionable to me. I mean, there was a lot of privacy going on during that period. And I whereas today we put our children into the bathtub together and they can see each other's genitals. I don't think, 125 years ago, parents were doing that. And so I'm really curious how he thinks that 3 to 6 year old children knew that there were alternate genitals. And there's nothing in he says it like it's just a given in his original works. And so I'm really curious. I mean, maybe I don't understand Victorian era parenting. Maybe they were put in the bathtub together, but I don't know how they were supposed to know that there was an alternative. But anyway, let's just take it on face. We're just telling you what Freud said. So looking down at the genitals helps them to realize that they are one or the other gender. And they called it gender back then. And today we would say sex based on the biological, but let's just go with Freudian terminology. So he said once they looked down and saw their genitals, that started the development of their gender identity. And that it kicked off the beginning of either the Oedipal or the Electra complex, depending on whether you were male or female. So if you're male, you're going to follow the Oedipal conflict where you fall in love with your mother and want to murder your father, just like Oedipus Rex in the old fable. And so little boys go through this period where they only want to sit on their mom's laps. They only want to hold their mom's hands. And they really try to marginalize dad and get him maybe to give up and go away. And that theoretically little girls do this also, where they fall in love with their fathers and want to, murder their mothers, is how Freud characterizes it. The resolution of the Oedipal phase is that the little boy realizes that dad's not getting the hint and that ultimately he's going to have to murder dad if he's going to get rid of dad. But then he realizes that dad's too strong and his penis is larger. And so he ultimately develops what Freud calls castration anxiety. He's worried that if dad finds out all of this animosity that he's been holding towards dad, that dad will retaliate by castrating the little boy and making him have genitals like mom's. And then mom won't want him. And so that castration anxiety causes the little boy to repress all of this lust for his mom and all this animosity towards his dad, and instead flip the script and say, I'm going to identify with dad, and I'm going to try to become as much like dad as I possibly can so that someday in the future I can attract a woman like mom for myself. All right, let's just go with it, and let's talk about the female side. Same exact everything happens. I want to murder mom. How can I murder her? She's bigger and stronger. Here's where Freud ran into trouble, and he ultimately abandoned the Electra conflict because of this. He ran into trouble because, remember I told you that little girls look down and think they've already been castrated? So they can't have castration anxiety. They think they've already been castrated. So what is going to keep a little girl from just going ahead and attempting to murder her mother? What is there to stop her? She has nothing to fear, according to Freud. So he really just sort of spun out on that and ultimately came to the conclusion it doesn't work well for girls. Some of his followers tried to tie it up into a neat little bow and say, well, maybe because they don't have castration anxiety, little girls never really resolve their Electra complex. And they say, see, and little girls grow up to be women who kind of compete with their moms for the rest of their lives and always feel like their dad is ideal. And a bunch of stereotyping and generalizations follow from that. So ultimately, I think even Freud would say the conflict probably shouldn't be on this list. I think a lot of us would say maybe Oedipal conflict shouldn't be, but let me tell you something interesting. So I, as a student, when I didn't have children and stuff, like I was like, oh, this is crazy. I never felt like that about my dad. This doesn't make sense. This is all crazy. Then I had children. And when my daughter was exactly 3 years old, I gave her a bath. We're drying off, having our little, chatty, it's getting ready time for bed moments. And she goes, when I grow up, I'm going to marry daddy. And I'm like, interesting. You are exactly in the phallic stage and you're saying this to me. I said that in my head. I didn't tell her that. I go, really? And then she narrows her little eyes and she goes, but you won't let me. I was like, It's a little on the nose. Okay, hide the knives tonight because I think mommy's getting murdered. I go, no, you can have him. I thought that was kind of strange. And then I had a little boy, and he spent the period from about 3 years of age till about 6 years of age sitting on my lap, holding my hands. If we went to a restaurant and had a booth and he and his sister were supposed to sit on one side and dad and I were supposed to sit on the other side, he would come and wedge himself between me and my husband until one of us would fall off and have to move. He was like, I was his for sure. And it was really funny because my husband was like, I don't think he likes me. I mean, he doesn't want to be around me. He doesn't, want to do anything because I want to do. I'm like, you got her this whole time, right? You got the older one. She's been in love with you this whole time. Give me a second of having adoration coming from one of the children. Come on, man. So yeah, I kind of enjoyed my Oedipal conflict child better than my electric conflict child, that's for sure. They both grew out of it, obviously, and they did both end up displaying a lot of behaviors that they saw each of us doing. But, I have to say in the long run, my son's personality is more like mine and my daughter's personality is more like my husband's. So I'm going to have to refute the idea that they just glommed onto their, same-sex parent and adopted all of the same hobbies and interests and styles, because they didn't. They didn't do it. So I'm going to have to argue with Freud on that. But I will have to agree with them that it looked like they went through those conflicts. Now, the next stage is called the latent stage, and this is from 6 years to puberty. And Freud said there was no erogenous zone where psychic energy was attached, so he didn't think that the latent period was particularly important for personality development. But some of his followers pointed out that it looks like a lot of psychic energy is directed outward towards social demands and academic demands. During this period, 6 years to puberty, children spend a lot of time with same-sex friends, developing platonic relationships, and that there's important development going on with that, and that there's a lot of pressure to do well in school and learn the stuff that you're being taught in school. And so they thought maybe the psychic energy was directed outward, and so that this was still an important part of development. Just because it wasn't attached to a body doesn't make it unimportant, they were arguing. The last stage is called the genital stage, and this is where we're supposed to be from puberty on, where once you've reached full sexual maturation, you'll start to have mature sexual interest. So this is the first time that Freud actually means sexual stuff. Everything else, the use of the term erogenous zone had nothing to do with sex. It had strictly to do with, the part of the body that was where the psychic energy was residing. So we've got mature sexual interests, and now we have all these pressures of adulthood that are on us to maintain, relationships with our family of origin, with our friends, to, establish a profession, to find a mate, make children, all these, like a lot of pressures on adults. And so Freud says it's really super important that all of our needs were adequately met during each of those previous stages, so that when we arrive in the genital stage, all of our psychic energy is with us. But one of the things he pointed out is that most of us don't have our needs appropriately met at each of the earlier stages. And so we can end up with a fixation. So if your parents didn't, wean you at the right time of the oral stage, you could end up with a personality that displays a lot of dependence and then behaviors that display a lot of oral fixation, where you chew gum or you are always drinking water or you talk a lot. Anything that has to do with the mouth, Freud would say would be evidence that you left some psychic energy behind at the oral stage. During the anal stage, there's two ways that things can go if your parents didn't meet your needs appropriately. And this would be if they potty trained you too rigidly, you can end up with an anal retentive personality type where you're really focused on order and neatness and timeliness and these kinds of things to the point where you're super rigid. Or if your parents potty trained you too late, you can end up anal expulsive, which is where you're messy and you can't keep track of time or commitments, and you're unrestrained, basically. In the phallic stage, if you don't have a parent of the opposite sex to fixate on, then you may have difficulty ever resolving these impulses, or you may fixate on your same-sex parent who is there. And then on the resolution side, when it's time for that, you may end up identifying with whichever parent is there, whether that's your sex or the other sex. You'll end up identifying with whoever's there, according to him. And so he thought that the phallic stage was the place where he was focusing on sexual orientation. He really thought that if you didn't have both sex parents in the household, that you would end up identifying with whichever parent was there, and that might have an impact on who you find attractive, being similar to whoever your parent thought was attractive. And then in the latent stage, Freud would say that you couldn't get fixated here, but his followers would say that people who had their needs, incorrectly met during the latent stage would be too focused on platonic friendships and too focused on like work, to the exclusion of the mature interests of finding a mate and making children. So this is obviously a model that was written between 1880 and 1920. So take all of the little characterizations and fixations that I said with that complete grain of salt, having to do with, based on the time period and stuff like that. But we're going to find that Freud's theory has had a big impact on lots of other theorists and lots of interpretations of behaviors and stuff like that. So it's really important for you to understand Freud's theories from the beginning. All right, well, in the next section, we'll talk about Erikson, which is another psychodynamic theory. So let's go ahead and take a break, and I'll see you in the next segment.